March 17, 1910, Harlan County, Kentucky. Edward Crowley, 25 years old, son of one of the wealthiest tobacco plantation owners in the region, left the main house at approximately 7 in the evening to check on a mare that had shown signs of distress earlier that day. He never returned. 3 days later, farmhands discovered his body hanging from the rafters of the horse stable, his hands bound behind his back, with leather straps typically used for breaking young colts. The coroner's report noted something peculiar. Edward's boots were placed neatly at the base of the ladder leading up to the beam, as if he had removed them himself before climbing. But the bindings told a different story. Someone had been with him, someone he trusted enough to turn his back on. Within 6 months, every member of the Crowley family would be found dead under circumstances that defied explanation. Each death appeared to be an accident or suicide at first glance, but when examined together, they formed a pattern so methodical, so personal, that investigators could no longer ignore what was unfolding at Thornfield Estate, a systematic elimination carried out with intimate knowledge of the family's routines, fears, and secrets. The only person who seemed to vanish alongside these deaths was a young man named Silas Mercer, the stable boy who had worked the property since he was 14 years old. A quiet, unremarkable figure who knew every corner of the estate, every hiding place, every shadow. Welcome to this journey into one of Kentucky's most disturbing unsolved cases. Before we begin, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your location. Are you alone? Are the lights on? This story demands attention, and I want to know who is brave enough to follow it to its conclusion. Thornfield Estate sat 12 miles outside the town of Harlan, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense forest and across 2 creek beds that flooded regularly in spring. The Crowley family had owned this land since 1848, purchasing it with wealth accumulated through tobacco farming and what they politely called traditional labor practices. By 1910, slavery had been abolished for 45 years, but the Crowleys maintained a workforce of sharecroppers and hired laborers who lived in conditions barely distinguishable from bondage. Augustus Crowley, the patriarch, was known throughout the county as a hard man who expected absolute obedience. His wife, Miriam, maintained the household with cold efficiency. Their 3 children had been raised to view themselves as inherently superior to those who worked their land. Margaret, the eldest at 28, managed the estate's finances. Edward oversaw the tobacco fields. Thomas, only 19, was being groomed to eventually take over the entire operation. They were a family accustomed to power, accustomed to control, accustomed to the fear they inspired in others. But in 1910, something shifted. Someone decided that fear could flow in both directions. The question that haunted investigators then and continues to disturb historians today is simple yet terrible. Was Silas Mercer a victim who finally fought back, or was he something far more sinister? And if he was responsible, how did a 21-year-old stable boy manage to kill 5 people over the course of 6 months without leaving behind a single witness or definitive piece of evidence? The answer may lie not in what was found, but in what remains hidden beneath the soil of Thornfield Estate. To understand what happened at Thornfield Estate in 1910, we must first understand the world in which it existed. Kentucky in the early 20th century occupied a peculiar position in American society. Though technically part of the Union during the Civil War, it had been a slave state, and its culture remained deeply rooted in the hierarchies of the antebellum South. The abolition of slavery had legally ended in 1865, but the social structures it created persisted through new mechanisms: sharecropping, debt peonage, and Jim Crow laws that enforced strict racial segregation. Harlan County, where Thornfield Estate was located, was particularly isolated. The mountainous terrain made travel difficult, and many families who settled there in the mid-1800s remained largely cut off from the modernization occurring in larger cities. Electricity had not yet reached most rural areas. Telephones were rare. Law enforcement consisted of a single sheriff and perhaps 2 deputies responsible for hundreds of square miles of territory. The Crowley family had established themselves as landed gentry in this isolated pocket of Kentucky. Augustus Crowley's grandfather, Jeremiah Crowley, had purchased the original tract of land in 1848 with money made from tobacco speculation in Virginia. The family legend, repeated in county histories and newspaper articles, claimed that Jeremiah had been a benevolent slave owner who treated his people well. This sanitized version of history omitted the documented cases of runaways from the Crowley plantation, the advertisements Jeremiah had placed in newspapers offering rewards for their capture, and the punishment records that survived in family papers discovered decades later. By 1910, Augustus Crowley owned over 800 acres of land, including tobacco fields, timber forests, and grazing pastures. The main house, a 2-story structure built in the Greek Revival style, stood at the center of the property. Surrounding it were various outbuildings, the stable where Edward would be found dead, the tobacco barns where the harvest was dried, the smokehouse, the tool shed, and a row of small cabins where hired workers lived. Among these workers was the Mercer family. Daniel Mercer, Silas's father, had come to work at Thornfield Estate in 1893. Records indicate he had previously worked at a coal mine in nearby Bell County, but sought more stable employment after a collapse killed several of his co-workers. He arrived at Thornfield with his wife Ruth and their infant son, Silas. The Crowleys provided the Mercers with a 1-room cabin at the edge of the property and paid Daniel a wage that, while meager, was apparently sufficient to keep the family from leaving. Daniel Mercer worked at Thornfield for 6 years before his death in 1899. The official cause, according to estate records, was a farming accident involving a plow. He was 32 years old. Ruth Mercer died less than a year later from what was described in the county death register as fever. She was 29. Silas Mercer, now orphaned at age 6, should have been sent to the county poorhouse or placed with relatives. Instead, Augustus Crowley made a decision that would later seem either remarkably charitable or deeply sinister. He allowed the boy to remain at Thornfield Estate. Silas would work for his keep, starting with simple tasks like feeding chickens and collecting eggs, gradually taking on more responsibility as he grew older. By age 14, Silas had become the primary stable boy, responsible for caring for the Crowleys' horses, maintaining tack and equipment, and assisting with any task involving the animals. Those who remembered him from this period described him as quiet, diligent, and unnaturally patient with even the most difficult horses. He rarely spoke unless spoken to. He kept his eyes down when addressing members of the Crowley family. He appeared, by all accounts, to be the model of what the Crowleys considered proper behavior for someone of his station. But there were hints, even then, that something festered beneath this obedient exterior. A schoolteacher in Harlan recalled that Silas attended the 1-room schoolhouse sporadically between ages 7 and 11, whenever he could be spared from work at the estate. She remembered him as intelligent but withdrawn, often arriving with bruises that he refused to explain. Another worker who left Thornfield in 1908 later told investigators that Silas had a habit of disappearing for hours at a time, vanishing into the forests surrounding the property, returning without explanation. The winter of 1909 to 1910 was particularly harsh in eastern Kentucky. Temperatures dropped below zero for weeks at a time. Snow blocked roads, Families burned through their winter stores faster than anticipated. At Thornfield Estate, conditions were tense. Augustus Crowley, facing declining tobacco prices and increasing debts, became more demanding of his workers and family alike. Arguments erupted regularly in the main house, loud enough to be heard by those working nearby. It was during this winter that something changed in Silas Mercer. Multiple witnesses would later report that he seemed different when spring arrived, more confident, more present, as if he had come to some internal decision. When Edward Crowley disappeared on that March evening, Silas was one of the last people to see him alive. The discovery of Edward Crowley's body in the stable on March 20th, 1910, sent shockwaves through Harlan County. Sheriff Raymond Holcomb arrived at Thornfield Estate within hours of receiving word, accompanied by Deputy Frank Morrison and the county coroner, Dr. Samuel Keating. What they found troubled them immediately. Edward hung from a thick oak beam that ran the length of the stable, positioned above the fourth stall from the entrance. The leather straps binding his wrists were identified as reins typically stored in the tack room. His neck bore marks consistent with hanging, but Dr. Keating noted in his initial report several anomalies that suggested the scene had been staged. First, there were bruises on Edward's torso and arms that appeared to predate his death by several hours. Second, fibers under his fingernails indicated he had been crawling or dragging himself across hay at some point. Third, and most disturbing, there were rope burns on his ankles that matched no rope found at the scene. Sheriff Holcomb interviewed everyone present at the estate that evening. Augustus Crowley claimed he had last seen his son at dinner around 6 o'clock. Edward had mentioned checking on the mare and left through the back door. When he failed to return by 9, the family assumed he had been delayed or decided to sleep in the stable, something he occasionally did during foaling season. They did not begin searching until the following morning. Miriam Crowley's statement was brief and delivered with remarkable composure. She had retired to her room early with a headache and had not seen Edward after dinner. Margaret confirmed her mother's account. Thomas, the youngest son, stated that he had played cards with his father until approximately 10 o'clock before going to bed. The workers were questioned next. Most claimed to have been in their cabins by nightfall. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and no one ventured out unnecessarily after dark. Only 2 people admitted to being near the stable that evening: Jacob Walsh, a farmhand who had checked on a sick calf around 7:30, and Silas Mercer, who lived in a small room above the tack area and therefore was technically present at the scene of the death throughout the night. Silas's testimony was matter-of-fact and disturbingly calm. He stated that Edward had arrived at the stable around 7:15, examined the mare, and appeared satisfied with her condition. Edward had then asked Silas to prepare a particular saddle for an early morning ride the following day. Silas agreed and claimed he returned to his room shortly after Edward left. He heard nothing unusual during the night. When asked directly if he had any reason to harm Edward Crowley, Silas looked Sheriff Holcomb in the eye and said simply, "No, sir. Mr. Edward never did me any harm." The phrasing of that statement would haunt Holcomb for months. Afterward, the official verdict from the coroner's inquest was suicide while in a state of mental disturbance. This conclusion satisfied no one. Augustus Crowley insisted his son had no reason to take his own life. Edward had been in good health, engaged to be married to a young woman from Lexington, and actively involved in managing the family's business affairs. The ruling was convenient, however, in that it avoided the implications of murder, which would have required extensive investigation, and potentially exposed the family to unwanted scrutiny. Life at Thornfield Estate attempted to return to normal. Edward was buried in the family plot on a hillside overlooking the main house. A simple stone marked his grave. Edward Augustus Crowley, 1885-1910, beloved son and brother. The Crowleys did not speak publicly about his death. Workers were instructed not to discuss it. Silas Mercer continued his duties in the stable as if nothing had happened. But something had been set in motion that could not be stopped. On May 2nd, 1910, 6 weeks after Edward's death, Miriam Crowley failed to appear for breakfast. This was unprecedented. Miriam maintained rigid schedules and expected others to do the same. Augustus sent Margaret to check on her mother. The scream that followed brought the entire household running to the second floor. Miriam Crowley was found in her bathtub, submerged in water that had long since gone cold. She was fully clothed in her nightgown. Her eyes were open. The door to her bedroom had been locked from the inside, and the key was found on her nightstand. There were no signs of struggle, no wounds, no indication of how she had ended up in the bathtub. Dr. Keating's examination determined the cause of death to be drowning, but he privately expressed doubts to Sheriff Holcomb. Miriam's lungs contained water, yes, but her body showed peculiar markings, faint bruises on her shoulders, as if she had been held down, and small scratches on her palms, as if she had gripped something tightly in her final moments. The toxicology analysis available in 1910 was primitive, but Dr. Keating suspected she may have been drugged before being placed in the water. The locked door presented a problem. How could someone have killed Miriam and then locked the door from the inside before leaving? Sheriff Holcomb examined the room meticulously. The windows were latched from within. There was no other entrance. Unless Miriam had locked herself in and then somehow been overpowered by someone already hiding in the room, the physical evidence suggested suicide. Once again, this was the official conclusion. Once again, the Crowley family rejected it. Miriam had been a devout woman who attended church regularly and would never have taken her own life. Augustus demanded a more thorough investigation, but Holcomb found himself stymied by the lack of evidence and the physical impossibility of the crime scene. During this investigation, Silas Mercer was questioned again. He had been working in the stable all morning, he claimed, and knew nothing of Miriam's death until the screaming began. Several workers corroborated his presence in the stable. He could not possibly have been in Miriam's room. When asked if he had noticed anything unusual about the family in recent weeks, Silas paused before responding. "They seemed afraid, sir," he said. "Afraid of what?" Holcomb pressed. Silas shrugged. "I couldn't say, but they kept looking over their shoulders." The question now hangs before us, as it hung before the people of Harlan County in that terrible spring of 1910. Were these deaths connected? Was someone systematically killing the Crowley family? And if so, how were they managing to make each death appear to be something other than murder? Tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. Do you believe these were truly suicides, or is something more sinister at work? Your theories might help us unravel what happens next. The summer of 1910 brought oppressive heat to eastern Kentucky. Tobacco plants wilted in the fields despite constant watering. The creeks that normally ran full in warm months slowed to trickles. At Thornfield Estate, the remaining Crowleys, now 3 in number, moved through their days with visible paranoia. Augustus hired additional workers to maintain constant watch over the property. He purchased locks for every door and instructed his children never to be alone. These precautions proved insufficient. On July 14th, Margaret Crowley went to the smokehouse to retrieve meat for the evening meal. The smokehouse was a small brick structure located approximately 50 yards from the main house, close enough to be visible from the kitchen windows. Margaret entered at 4:30 in the afternoon. By 4:45, when she had not returned, Augustus and Thomas went to investigate. They found Margaret on the floor of the smokehouse, surrounded by dozens of lit candles arranged in a pattern none of them recognized. The heat inside the confined space was unbearable, Margaret was dead, her body showing signs of severe heat stroke and dehydration. But the disturbing elements were the candles and what appeared to be symbols drawn in ash on the brick walls, circles, intersecting lines, what might have been words in a language neither Augustus nor Thomas could identify. Sheriff Holcomb arrived to find Augustus in a state of near hysteria. The man who had once commanded his workers, with absolute authority, was now demanding that the property be searched top to bottom, that everyone who worked there be arrested, that something, anything, be done to stop what was happening to his family. The investigation of Margaret's death yielded more questions than answers. The candles were common household candles of the type stored in the main house. The symbols on the walls were drawn in ash from the smokehouse fire pit, mixed with what Dr. Keating determined to be animal blood, likely from butchered hogs. Most troubling was the door. Like Miriam's bedroom, the smokehouse door had been found locked from the inside. The key was in Margaret's apron pocket. How had someone trapped her inside, lit candles, drawn symbols, and then locked the door behind them as they left? It was physically impossible, unless Margaret had done these things herself before succumbing to the heat. But witnesses, including her father and brother, insisted Margaret had been mentally sound that morning, showing no signs of suicidal ideation or occult interests. Silas Mercer's whereabouts during Margaret's death were once again accounted for. He had been repairing fencing in the north pasture with 2 other workers, both of whom swore he never left their sight between 3 and 5 that afternoon. Yet Holcomb noticed something during this interrogation, a certain stillness in Silas, a calm that seemed out of place given the horror unfolding around him. When asked how he felt about the deaths, Silas responded, "It's terrible, sir. The family doesn't deserve such suffering." The words were appropriate, the tone was not. It was at this point in the investigation that Sheriff Holcomb made a decision that would later be criticized as either brilliant or negligent. He ordered a thorough search of the Crowley main house, including private rooms and personal belongings. Over Augustus's protests, deputies spent 3 days examining every corner of the estate. In Margaret's room, they discovered a locked chest containing personal journals dating back to 1905. These journals, written in Margaret's precise handwriting, documented her role in managing the estate's finances, but they also contained passages that painted a very different picture of life at Thornfield than the one presented to outsiders. One entry from November 1907 read, "Father punished the Harker boy today for stealing an apple. 20 lashes in the barn. The boy couldn't have been more than 9 years old. When I suggested the punishment was excessive, Father reminded me that mercy is mistaken for weakness. The Harker family left the estate the following week." Another entry from March 1909. "Silas showed signs of insolence today. He looked directly at Edward when being given instructions, didn't lower his eyes as appropriate. Edward knocked him down with the riding crop. Father approved. Said the boy needs to remember his place. Later, I saw Silas in the stable, staring at nothing. There was blood on his collar. More entries detailed financial manipulation. Workers being charged for their housing and food at rates that ensured they could never save enough to leave, debts being inherited by children when parents died, a system of control that kept families bound to Thornfield Estate across generations. The journal entries stopped abruptly in December 1909. The final entry was a single sentence, "I cannot sleep. I hear footsteps outside my door at night, but when I look, no one is there." In Augustus's study, investigators found correspondence with other landowners discussing methods for maintaining discipline among workers. One letter, dated February 1910, just weeks before Edward's death, discussed the problem of uppity laborers who forget the natural order of things. Augustus had written, My own stable boy has become quietly defiant. He does his work, but I sense rebellion underneath. I should have expelled him years ago, but Edward insists he's too useful with the horses. Most damning were documents found in a hidden compartment within Augustus's desk. These were older papers, dating to the 1890s, detailing the death of Daniel Mercer, Silas's father. The official story had been a farming accident. The papers told a different tale. Daniel Mercer had attempted to leave Thornfield Estate in 1899, claiming Augustus owed him back wages. An altercation had occurred. Daniel had been struck in the head with a shovel, whether accidentally or intentionally, the document didn't specify. He died 3 days later. Augustus had ruled it an accident and paid for a simple burial. No investigation had been conducted. Ruth Mercer, Daniel's widow, had been warned that if she spoke of what happened, she and her son would be expelled from the estate with nothing. Ruth had died less than a year after her husband, officially of fever. But a note in Augustus's handwriting, tucked among the papers, suggested something else. R.M. refused to eat for 2 weeks. Said she couldn't live with what happened. Died in her cabin last night. The boy found her, told him it was fever. He's too young to understand, and he has nowhere else to go. When confronted with these documents, Augustus Crowley's facade finally crumbled. He admitted that conditions at Thornfield Estate were harsh, but insisted they were necessary. He denied direct responsibility for Daniel Mercer's death, claiming it truly had been an accident, that the papers were simply his private thoughts, and didn't reflect reality. As for Ruth's death, he maintained she had been ill, but the portrait that emerged from these discoveries was clear. The Crowley family had maintained a system of cruelty and exploitation that, while technically legal in 1910, was morally indistinguishable from the slavery their grandfather had practiced. And at the center of this system, orphaned at age 6, raised by the family responsible for his parents' deaths, was Silas Mercer. Augustus Crowley and his son Thomas barricaded themselves in the main house after Margaret's death. They dismissed all workers except for a handful they believed they could trust. They armed themselves with hunting rifles. They took turns sleeping, each keeping watch while the other rested. They were preparing for a siege. It didn't matter. On September 8, 1910, Thomas Crowley was found dead in the tobacco barn. He had gone there in mid-afternoon against his father's instructions never to leave the house alone, to check on the drying tobacco crop. When he didn't return within the hour, Augustus gathered 3 workers and went searching. Thomas lay in the center of the barn floor, surrounded by bundles of hanging tobacco leaves. His throat had been cut. The wound was deep and precise, delivered by someone who knew what they were doing, but the strangest element was Thomas's expression. His face showed no fear, no surprise. He looked almost peaceful, as if he had expected this end and accepted it. The murder weapon was found nearby, a tobacco knife, a curved blade used for harvesting, with a handle that had been wrapped in leather cord for better grip. It was a tool Thomas himself used regularly. His fingerprints were on the handle, along with others that smudged and unclear. This time, there could be no pretense of suicide or accident. This was murder, plain and undeniable. Sheriff Holcomb ordered an immediate search for Silas Mercer, who had not been seen since the previous evening. His room above the stable was empty. His few belongings, a change of clothes, a water-damaged book of poetry, a wooden carving of a horse, all remained. A massive search was organized. Every building on the estate was examined. The forests were scoured. The creeks were dragged. No trace of Silas was found. He had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. Augustus Crowley, now the last surviving member of his family, descended into madness. He refused to leave the main house, convinced that Silas was hiding, somewhere on the property, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He hired guards to patrol day and night. He kept every window shuttered, every door locked. He wrote lengthy letters to the governor, to newspapers, to anyone who might listen, demanding justice for his murdered children. On November 3rd, 1910, one of the guards found Augustus dead in his bed. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle. The doors were still locked from the inside. The windows were still latched. Yet Augustus Crowley lay lifeless, his eyes wide open, his hands clutched around his own throat as if he had been choking himself. The official cause of death was determined to be heart failure brought on by extreme stress and paranoia. But the guards reported something strange. In the days before Augustus's death, they had heard him talking in his room late at night, not talking to himself, but conversing with someone else, as if another person were present. When questioned about this, Augustus had claimed he was praying, yet the guards insisted they heard two distinct voices, Augustus's and a younger man's voice that responded to him in calm, measured tones. Thornfield Estate was abandoned in early 1911. With no surviving Crowleys to claim it, the property fell into legal limbo. Distant cousins from Virginia emerged to contest ownership, but none wanted to actually live there. The land was eventually sold at auction in 1915 to a timber company that cleared the forests and let the buildings decay. For decades, the case of the Crowley family deaths remained officially unsolved. Silas Mercer was presumed dead, either by his own hand or through some misadventure in the wilderness. The prevailing theory among local law enforcement was that Silas had indeed killed the family in an act of revenge, then fled into the mountains where he perished from exposure or accident. But fragments continued to surface over the years, each adding new layers to the mystery. In 1934, a retired schoolteacher named Eleanor Pritchard published a small memoir of her years teaching in rural Kentucky. In it, she devoted several pages to her memories of Silas Mercer. She described him as one of the most intelligent children she had ever taught, capable of understanding complex mathematical concepts and demonstrating a remarkable memory for historical facts. But she also noted something troubling. Silas had a way of watching people, of studying them, that made even adults uncomfortable. It was as if he was cataloguing information, storing it away for future use. I once asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. He looked at me with those dark, unreadable eyes and said, "I want to understand why people do what they do." At the time, I thought it a curious but harmless ambition. Now I wonder what understanding he sought. In 1952, a team of historians from the University of Kentucky conducted research on labor conditions in Appalachia during the early 20th century. As part of this work, they interviewed elderly residents of Harlan County who had memories of Thornfield Estate. One man, Jacob Walsh, the same farmhand who had been working at Thornfield in 1910, was now 73 years old and willing to speak more freely than he had been 40 years earlier. Walsh's testimony, recorded on one of the first portable tape recorders, provided disturbing new details. He claimed that Silas Mercer had approached him several times in the months before. The deaths began, asking questions about the Crowley family's routines, their habits, their fears. He wanted to know things like what time they went to bed, whether they locked their doors, what they were afraid of in the dark, Walsh recounted. I thought he was just making conversation, but looking back, he was planning something. He was studying them like a hunter studies prey. Walsh also revealed something he had kept secret for decades. On the night of Edward Crowley's death, Walsh had not actually gone to check on a sick calf as he'd told Sheriff Holcomb. He had gone to meet a woman he was courting, sneaking away from his cabin to avoid detection. On his way back around midnight, he had passed near the stable. He heard voices inside, Edward's voice, raised in anger, and another voice responding in calm, steady tones. Walsh couldn't make out the words, but the tone of the second voice chilled him. "It was Silas," Walsh said. "I'm certain of it. and he sounded like he was explaining something to Edward, like a teacher explaining a lesson to a student, and then everything went quiet. Walsh had been too frightened to report this, fearing he would be implicated in the murder. He had lived with the guilt ever since. In 1967, a graduate student named Patricia Holloway wrote her master's thesis on unsolved crimes in Kentucky history. As part of her research, she obtained permission to examine what remained of the Crowley family papers, now held in a county archive. Among these papers, she discovered something that had been overlooked in the original investigation: a series of letters written by Miriam Crowley to her sister in Lexington during the winter of 1909 to 1910. These letters, written in increasingly frantic tones, documented Miriam's growing unease about Silas. She wrote that he had begun to unnerve her, that he moved too quietly through the estate, appearing suddenly where he shouldn't be. "I saw him yesterday, standing in the shadow of the barn, just watching the house," one letter read. "When I mentioned it to Augustus, he dismissed my concerns, but I swear the boy was smiling, not a friendly smile, something else, something that made my blood run cold." Another letter, dated February 20th, 1910, just weeks before Edward's death, was even more explicit. "I found the boy in the library yesterday. He claimed he was looking for a book Edward had asked him to fetch, but the library door had been locked, and he had no key. When I demanded to know how he entered, he simply said, 'Doors don't keep people out if they want to get in badly enough.' Augustus still refuses to dismiss him. He says Silas is too valuable with the horses, but I believe we're keeping a wolf among us." Perhaps most intriguing was a discovery made in 1983 when the remains of the old Thornfield stable were finally demolished to make way for a state highway. Workers clearing the site found, hidden beneath rotted floorboards in what had been Silas's room, a metal box containing personal items. Inside were several objects: a faded photograph of a man and woman, presumably Daniel and Ruth Mercer, a child's drawing of a house, and a handwritten journal. The journal was damaged by moisture and age, but portions were legible. It appeared to be a record kept by Silas from approximately 1905 to 1910, starting when he was around 11 years old. Early entries were simple: notes about horses, weather observations, brief descriptions of his daily tasks. But as the years progressed, the entries became darker. One passage from 1907 read, "Father told me once that knowledge is power. The Crowleys think I am simple, that I am nothing more than a tool for their use, but I watch them. I learn them. I know where every key is hidden. I know which floorboards creak. I know what they fear in the dark. Someday, this knowledge will matter." Another entry, undated but likely from 1909 based on context, was even more chilling. "Edward struck me today for moving too slowly. I did not react. I have learned that patience is its own form of strength. They think they are untouchable. They think there will never be consequences for what they've done. They are wrong. I dream of making them understand what it feels like to be powerless, to be afraid, to know that death is coming and being unable to stop it. I dream of giving them the same mercy they gave my parents." The final entry in the journal was dated November 2nd, 1910, the day before Augustus Crowley's death. It consisted of a single sentence: "It is finished. I can rest now." The journal was turned over to the Kentucky State Police, who reopened the case briefly in 1983. However, with all principals long dead and no new evidence that could lead to any form of prosecution, the investigation was closed again within months. The journal itself was catalogued as historical evidence and stored in the State Archive, where it remains today. One final fragment deserves mention. In 1991, a man named Thomas Garrett, a genealogist researching Appalachian family histories, claimed to have discovered records suggesting that Silas Mercer had not died in 1910. According to Garrett's research, a man matching Silas's description and approximate age appeared in census records from Illinois in 1920, living under the name Samuel Morrison, working as a veterinarian specializing in horses. The man listed his birthplace as Kentucky and indicated he had no living family. Garrett attempted to trace this. Samuel Morrison further but found that the trail ended in 1928. No death certificate was ever filed. No property records existed after that date. Samuel Morrison simply disappeared from all official records, as completely as Silas Mercer had vanished from Thornfield Estate 18 years earlier. Whether Samuel Morrison was indeed Silas Mercer, whether he lived out his years in quiet anonymity or met some unknown end, remains unverified. But the possibility that he survived, that he escaped the consequences of his actions and built a new life elsewhere, haunts the minds of those who study this case. To this day, no one knows with certainty what happened at Thornfield Estate in 1910. The official records list 5 deaths, 2 suicides, 2 accidents, and 1 murder. Yet the unofficial story, pieced together from fragments and testimonies, suggests something far more deliberate, far more personal. 3 theories have emerged over the decades, each attempting to explain the inexplicable. The first theory, favored by law enforcement then and now, is straightforward. Silas Mercer systematically murdered the Crowley family in revenge for the death of his parents and the abuse he suffered while in their employment. He used his intimate knowledge of the estate and the family's routines to stage each death to appear as something other than murder. The locked rooms, the impossible logistics, these were elements of careful planning by someone who had years to observe and prepare. After killing Augustus, the final member of the family, Silas fled and either died in the wilderness or successfully disappeared into anonymity elsewhere. This theory is supported by the journals, the testimony of Jacob Walsh, and the simple logic of motive and opportunity. Silas had every reason to hate the Crowleys. He had the knowledge and access necessary to carry out the murders, and his disappearance immediately following the final death suggests guilt and flight. But this theory fails to explain certain elements. How did Silas lock doors from the inside after leaving rooms? How did he appear to be in 2 places at once, as in the case of Margaret's death, when he had witnesses confirming his presence elsewhere? And most troubling, how did he enter Augustus's heavily guarded house, kill the man, and leave without any guard seeing him or finding evidence of forced entry? The second theory, put forth by some historians and paranormal investigators, suggests that supernatural forces were at play. According to this interpretation, the Crowley family's crimes had attracted a curse or demonic attention. Silas Mercer may have been a willing participant or an unwitting vessel for these forces. The impossible logistics of the murders, the locked rooms, the symbols drawn in the smokehouse all point to something beyond natural explanation. Proponents of this theory note that similar cases of systematic family deaths with supernatural elements have been documented throughout history. They point to the strange voices guards heard in Augustus's room, the peaceful expression on Thomas's face despite having his throat cut, and the reports from Miriam's letters about Silas appearing where he shouldn't be able to reach. This theory appeals to those who believe there are forces in the world that operate beyond the laws of physics and logic. But it requires accepting premises that many find difficult to embrace. The third theory, perhaps the most disturbing, suggests that Silas Mercer was not acting alone. This interpretation holds that other workers at Thornfield Estate, people who had also suffered under the Crowley family's cruelty, assisted him in carrying out the murders. The locked rooms could be explained if someone had access to keys or knowledge of hidden entrances. The alibis could be fabrications, workers protecting each other through coordinated lies. According to this theory, what happened at Thornfield Estate was not the action of a lone avenger, but a collective uprising, a conspiracy of the oppressed against their oppressors. The fact that no one ever broke silence, that all witnesses maintained consistent stories even decades later, suggests either remarkable loyalty or shared complicity. This theory transforms the case from a tale of individual revenge into something more complex, a statement about justice, about the breaking point of human endurance, about what happens when systems of cruelty are maintained across generations. Which theory is correct? Perhaps all of them contain elements of truth. Perhaps none fully capture what occurred during those terrible months in 1910. What we know for certain is this: 5 people died at Thornfield Estate. A young man who had every reason to hate them disappeared. And in the decades since, the land where these events unfolded has never been successfully settled or developed. Multiple attempts to build on the property have been abandoned after workers reported feeling watched, hearing footsteps in empty buildings, seeing shadows that moved independently of any light source. The ruins of Thornfield Estate still stand in what is now a state forest in eastern Kentucky. The stable where Edward died collapsed in the 1960s. The main house burned under mysterious circumstances in 1975, but the stone foundations remain overgrown with vegetation, marked only by a small historical plaque that notes the property's existence without mentioning the deaths that occurred there. Local legend holds that if you visit the site on certain nights, particularly in March or November, you can hear voices in the darkness. Some say it's the Crowley family calling out for help that will never come. Others claim it's Silas Mercer still keeping watch over the place where he lost everything and found his terrible purpose. If you found this case as haunting as I did, I want you to do something for me. Click that subscribe button, ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode. And most importantly, share your theories in the comments below. Was Silas Mercer a victim driven to desperate action, or something darker? Were these murders or justice? Let's discuss this in our haunted community of truth seekers. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of Kentucky's darkest mysteries. Until next time, remember that history is not always what the official records claim. Sometimes the truth is buried far deeper than any grave. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay safe.